earlier in this course, we were talking about the definition of globalization and how it can mean different things to different people. There are also different evaluations of its consequences. So today I have with me Professor Mitchell Smith, an expert in this area, to help us talk a little bit about what we mean by globalization. So Professor Smith, tell us what you mean by globalization.
Well, globalization is certainly an overused concept, and it means, as you said, many different things to many different people. When I teach about globalization, I like to focus on very concrete meanings of it, and usually I think in terms of economic globalization, and that entails both trade and finance. And I would tend to emphasize financial globalization as the really potent force that's been at work over the last 1 to 2 decades. Global trade has expanded tremendously and has all kinds of economic and political consequences and social consequences. Financial globalization, I think, has had dramatic consequences because of its enormity of scale. Both the speed and the volume of capital that moves around the globe has tremendous consequences.
So when you mention consequences, what are those exactly? So what are some of the positive benefits of economic interactions that we tend to think of when we think about globalization?
Well, the way this is supposed to work is that capital, of course, is supposed to flow from those countries that have a surplus of it to those countries that have a deficit of it, so that what you should see over time is development spreading gradually across the globe and less developed areas benefiting from the knitting together of the globe economically. Of course, in practice, it doesn't always work like that, and it doesn't work like that evenly across countries. We do see cases of successful transmission of the benefits of globalization. We also see dire consequences. Obviously, the global financial crisis that we just recently experienced was one example of the transmission of those dire consequences across countries. And even there, once again, the consequences were uneven because different countries have different capabilities to deal with the turmoil involved with the financial crisis.
So some might say when you study globalization, some might argue that with free and open interactions in the global economy, that I guess we could say all boats rise with that rising tide, right? Even though, as you say, the consequences may be uneven. But yet we know that there are those that really are upset about globalization and upset about the negative consequences, or these, as you say, uneven consequences. What are we to make of that?
Well, I think in keeping with the maritime metaphor of boats rising, I mean, the fact is that some boats are more seaworthy than others, and some of them will in fact rise. Others won't rise with the tide, and others have holes in the hull and will start to sink as the water rises. So different governments have different capabilities. They have problems ranging from indebtedness to corruption to ineffective governance. And then there are issues like poverty, for example, that create conditions under which beginning to climb the development ladder becomes extremely difficult. So not every country is sufficiently well positioned to benefit from global flows. In fact, the picture is a very mixed one. I think one cannot say that globalization is a bad thing, economic globalization, that is a bad thing or a good thing. It can be good under certain conditions for certain countries and for certain people in those countries. It's also hazardous for some people in some countries under certain conditions and at certain times.
So what might be some of those conditions that will help explain the differences in outcomes?
I think one thing that's very important is to distinguish between the trade element of globalization and the financial element of globalization. This segment is entitled Globalization, Its Discontents, and in fact there's a book by that title by George Stiglitz in which he, I think, makes a very powerful argument about the distinction between global trade, which economists agree is almost uniformly beneficial to countries, and global finance. And I think that it's become very clear over the last 2 decades or so, as there have been a succession of financial crises, starting with the Mexican financial crisis, a Russian financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, all the way up to the present, that unfettered flows of capital can leave a lot of wreckage in their wake if they're not regulated carefully. I still think that there's not agreement on the best way to regulate and manage that form of globalization, but I do think there's a deeper understanding that it can be hazardous if not managed appropriately.
So students, what do you think? Is globalization something that can be managed? Is it uncontrollable? Who benefits and who doesn't? Let us know.